Greetings, Slashaholics. This is David Bergantino, author of the Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror books, the Bard's Blood horror Shakespeare books, and writer-designer of the upcoming horror video game, Return, One Way Trip. You're listening to the 80 Slasher Librarian's narration of my book,
Wes Craven's New Nightmare, Chapter 3. The limo driver was watching her again. Their eyes met in the rearview mirror, and he looked away quickly. As soon as she stumbled out of the New Line building, the insolence in his expression had vanished. Now he seemed genuinely worried about her. Probably thinks I'm crazy, Heather thought darkly. Well, he can join the club. It seemed likely that Bob Shea was having doubts about her sanity. Who else but a crazy person wouldn't jump at the chance to be in a new Elm Street movie? And if that wasn't enough, she had exhibited an obsession for nightmares and telephones. He wasn't hiding anything, except possibly his disappointment with her reaction to the proposition. If he had seemed afraid of anything, it had no doubt been that she might start foaming at the mouth. As for all the coffee, the way that office ran, it would have been a shock to see any less of the stuff. It had taken several minutes for the paranoia to wear off. Very little lingered. Only embarrassment was left, and disappointment. Heather had to admit it. All along she'd secretly hoped that someone else was suffering as she had been. Just hearing about one phone call would have changed everything. It would have meant that she wasn't alone. But she was alone. The pseudo-Freddy had been very careful to make her his only target. His tone, however deranged, was intimate. No one else had ever picked up a ringing phone and found him there, either by accident or by intention. And both Chase and the police had tried. For a while it seemed like a solution. Always have somebody else answer the phone. But she resented feeling like a prisoner in her own home, so she didn't stick with it. And he invariably caught her. Heather supposed that news of Wes's nightmares had punched her buttons. Even if they weren't having the same dreams, the conclusion her mind leaped to the moment Bob brought up the subject, Wes would still be the best person to talk to. But approaching him with her problems might be a gross imposition. He wasn't a psychologist after all, so there she was, alone again. Whatever was happening to her, the damage with Bob was done. Acting like a lunatic was not the most graceful way of declining a generous offer. Besides, she hadn't fully made up her mind about the new movie. Wes's participation was a big draw. His presence guaranteed a level of depth and quality that she thought was missing in the more recent Elm Streets. Also, the thing might actually be scary. Freddy sure wasn't as menacing as he used to be. Now he was more like a Henny Youngman with a claw. "Kill my wife, please." Nothing wrong with a good laugh, of course, but Freddy's bon vivant attitude tended to trivialize the violent acts he committed. Earlier, the talk show host asked if she thought horror was bad for children. It didn't necessarily have to be. Many children's stories had violent undercurrents, but the boundaries between good and evil in them were clear. But she was becoming more and more uncomfortable with the blurry morality of some youth-oriented entertainment. She didn't think it was quite the root of society's ills, but perhaps a flower that could bear dangerous seeds. Heather shook her head, trying to stop her brain from continuing to rev at high gear while her thoughts led nowhere. This was typical of how her mind worked when she was exhausted and hungry. It occurred to her she hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. The idea of taking a warm bath when she got home, after she checked on Dylan, crossed her mind. A bath always relaxed her. She just had to make sure she didn't fall asleep in the tub. The limo pulled up in front of Heather's house. As she stepped out onto the curb, she thanked the limo driver, who had not said a word the entire ride home. Surprisingly, he gave her a warm smile before he drove away. Halfway up the walk, the screaming started from inside her house. Bolting to the front door, she threw it open. The shrieks were coming from upstairs. She raced up the steps, taking them two at a time. As Heather entered Dylan's room, Julie looked up from beside his bed, her face frozen in panic. She was trying to hold on to Dylan, who was thrashing violently, tangled in the covers. In his fury, he almost threw Julie away from him. As Heather started forward, Dylan began screaming again, the sound alone driving her back. The horrendous, gut-wrenching wail seemed impossibly loud. It was the cry of someone being slowly and cruelly murdered, and somehow it was coming from her son. His eyelids were wide open, yet only the white showed. The wail tapered off and changed into a mumbling that grew steadily louder. Soon words could be made out, but the language that spawned them was alien. Heather stooped down to help Julie, but froze when Dylan roared again, this time in English.
Never sleep again. Never sleep again.
He bellowed in a deep, inhuman voice. Then his back arched, practically folding him in half. One arm struck Julie in the chest and she fell away from him. Then he was himself again, a broken little boy, sobbing uncontrollably. Heather looked down at Julie, who sat with her arms wrapped tightly around her. "What's going on? Was he watching the movie on TV again?" Julie had no idea what she was talking about. "Movie? He hasn't been watching TV at all. He was taking his nap when I heard him screaming." She couldn't go on. Her eyes closed in an attempt to block out the memory of the horrible sound. Heather went to the bed and kneeled down beside Dylan. He lay on his side, curled up in a fetal position. His sobbing was starting to taper off, and his eyes were those of a frightened animal. "Rex saved me," he said through the tears. "Rex? Who's Rex?" Dylan lifted the covers and reached in the direction of a lump underneath them. He pulled it out and handed her a plush dinosaur toy. She took it, and Rex nearly disintegrated in her hands. Stuffing leaked out of 4 deep gashes in the dinosaur's body. Looking at the gashes, Heather felt as though someone had punched her in the stomach. "Is Rex gonna die?" asked Dylan hopelessly. "No, Rex is not going to die," she said, realizing that Dylan was probably seeing the horror on her face. She tried not to think about how Rex could have gotten those cuts. Right now, Dylan needed taken care of, and fixing Rex was the best way to do that. "Julie," she said, turning, "you know where the sewing stuff is, don't you?" "Sure." Julie had reverted to her cheerful self for Dylan's benefit. Her smile wavered, and she grunted as she stood. Chances were good she would have a bruise on her sternum where Dylan had struck her. By the time she made it to her feet, the smile had won out. She pinched Dylan on the nose and said, "We'll do an operation. Dr. Dylan and Dr. Julie. We'll fix him up. Good as new." She took the dinosaur from Heather and lifted Dylan out of bed. Together they marched down to the kitchen to start the healing process. For a long time after, Heather just stared at Dylan's bed. A fluttering caught her eye. A wispy strand of dinosaur stuffing had stuck to her blouse. She pulled it off and shuddered. It felt like blood on her fingers. She ran downstairs to the phone. Another series of misdirections. Heather was finally connected to Chase at his special effects trailer in Palmdale. He had been in the middle of trying to froth bubbles for the commercial in just the right way when his cellular phone warbled. "What's up?" he yawned. He'd been frothing off and on for quite some time and was exhausted. In between, he tinked with the claw, but he wasn't going to tell Heather that. Not yet, at least. "Chase, you'd better come home." Her voice was so controlled he didn't sense her panic at first. "Heather, I'm stuck here. Neither Chuck nor Terry came in today." The word bastard shot briefly through his mind. I can't get away." "Chase, it's Dylan." He heard it now. She was just speaking low because Dylan must be nearby. He stood, the frothing lethargy instantly dissipating. "What?" "He's had some sort of episode." She was very close to crying now. What kind of episode?" Chase tried to remain calm. If he lost it, she wouldn't be able to tell him anything. And what she had to say was very important to him. "He was acting very strange. He thinks somebody's after him, Chase. It's scary. It scared me. He was acting like—" Her voice trailed off. "Like what?" he insisted. She was silent for a moment. Then her voice returned, but weakly. "Like Freddie." Chase had expected that answer, unfortunately, so he asked another question to which he knew the answer. "Heather, has there been another call?" She hesitated, not wanting to tell him. "Chase, why didn't Chuck or Terry show up?" she asked instead. He didn't know. Phone calls had gone unanswered and unreturned. Pretty soon he'd be worried about them, but that was later. "Forget those clowns, Heather. Answer me. Did you get a call from that guy or not?" She went silent again, and he waited patiently. Finally she answered. "Yes." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'll be there in 3 hours," he said immediately. "Don't speed, Chase. It's not—" He hung up. There was no point in discussing the matter any further until he reached home. Chase took the portable phone and flew to his pickup truck. He pulled away seconds later. He'd call a production company from the road, and maybe he'd give Terry and Chuck another try as well. If he could reach either of them, they could finish up the job and take care of the claw, which he left in the trailer. The dial tone whirred in her ears a few seconds before she hung up the phone. She considered calling him back. Knowing Chase, he was already on the freeway. It was out of her hands now. She hoped there wouldn't be another episode before he got home. Even with Julie there, she didn't know if she could handle it. Heather looked into the kitchen but didn't go in. Dr. Julie stitched up Rex while Dr. Dillon looked on hopefully. He looked like a normal little kid again, except for a dim glow of fear that remained in his eyes. A short time later, Heather ordered a pizza to be delivered. Julie stayed long enough to share it with them. After patching up Rex, she told Heather how helpless she had felt when Dillon had started screaming. If Heather hadn't come home when she did, Julie didn't know what she would have done. When it was time for her to leave, Julie seemed relieved when Dillon didn't beg her to stay. His episode had taken a lot out of her. She just kissed them both and left. Night soon descended, and a peaceful quiet enveloped the house. Bedtime for Dillon. At first he was difficult. He wanted to stay up until Chase returned home. Heather overruled him. Dillon obviously needed a good night's rest. However, it seemed to be the last thing he wanted. Eventually they struck a deal. He'd go quietly if she read him a bedtime story. That settled. She marched him up to his room and tucked him in bed. The first book she pulled from the shelf was Frog and Toad Are Friends by Arnold Lobel. It was the kind of pleasant story that she thought might smooth away the last wrinkles of the day. Dillon wouldn't have it. He insisted on the fable of Hansel and Gretel. She was about to refuse. She wasn't in the mood for a dark, dramatic tale tonight. But he threatened to become difficult again, so she relented. The day had worn her out as well. At least the story has a happy ending, she thought. So she made the room cozy by turning off all but the light beside his bed, pulled up a chair, and began to read, giving each character a different voice. Dillon was so engrossed by the tale that he didn't make a sound the entire time. As soon as the sun come up, the witch made Gretel fetch the wood and kindle a fire, Heather read as the story wound down. "We will bake the cookies first," she said. "I have heated the dough. Crawl in and see if the fire is blazing high enough now." And she pushed Gretel toward the oven. The witch meant to shut the door and bake her once she was inside. Heather made a face and put the book down. This wasn't how she wanted to send her son into dreamland. "Dillon, this is too violent. I don't know why you like these stupid old fairy tales." Dillon wiggled his feet impatiently and merely commanded, "Finish, please." "This is going to give you nightmares." His feet wiggled again, faster, and he looked up at her. "I like this story." And he wouldn't look away until she gave in. Heather sighed and picked up the book. But Gretel guessed what the witch was planning. "I don't know how to get in," Gretel said. "How am I supposed to manage it?" "Good work, Gretel. Play dumb." "Stupid girl!" shouted the witch, rushing up to the oven. "The opening is big enough. See, I can fit myself." Then quickly Gretel came behind and pushed with all her might, plunging the wicked old woman headlong into the flames, banging the door shut and bolting it tight. The witch howled. No, this was too much howling for one day. She closed the book. "That's enough." Heather turned, prepared for Dylan to protest again. Instead, he was sitting bolt upright in bed, his expression trance-like as he stared toward his window. "The witch howled like a scalded cat," he recited, "but Gretel ran away and left her there to perish nonetheless." She opened the book again. He had picked up the story right where she had left off. The words he spoke were exactly those printed on the page. She turned to ask him how he knew, but he was staring at her now. His eyes glittered in the lamplight. "She ran to her brother as fast as she could and flung open the door. 'Hansel, Hansel!' she cried. 'We are saved! The witch is dead!'" He blinked, the trance fading. Heather could only think of one thing to say. "Time for sleep." But he still wasn't ready. "Say how they find their way back home." No more. It was time for bed, for both of us. "Tomorrow night," she said, turning out the light. "No, tonight. It's important." He tugged on her sleeve. Pale blue moonlight lit his pleading face. But there was no fear there, and she had to laugh. "Dylan, you know as well as I do." "Probably better, considering your uncanny recitation." "They follow the trail of breadcrumbs back to their house. Then their father covers them with kisses, and they were safe," he finished with a satisfied smile. "They were safe and could sleep," Heather added. It seemed important to emphasize the sleep part. Dylan sank back into bed contently. Tucking him in, she noticed a lump under the covers near his feet. She patted it, wondering what it would be. "Rex," Dylan answered her look. He took a flashlight that sat beside his bed and lifted the comforter. Poking his head underneath, he motioned for her to follow. Curiouser and curiouser, she thought, and joined him under the covers. The comforter became a colorful tent around them. Dylan pointed the flashlight beam toward the foot of the bed. There lay Rex on his side, his back toward them. The stitching bowed him slightly in the middle. "Rex keeps him from coming up," Dylan told her very seriously. "Who?" "The mean man with the claws." Heather caught her breath for the millionth time that day. Dylan didn't notice her gaping and continued, in the matter-of-fact way little kids explain their world to non-comprehending adults. "He wants to come up from down there," he said, pointing beyond Rex. "While we sleep, I keep my feet up here." He indicated the safe area above Rex. "Rex keeps him down there. He's my guard." He turned back to her solemn. "You should have a guard too." Wherever did he get that idea? Heather suddenly became light-headed. "Dylan, there's nothing down there." Her voice was rising in panic. "Look!" She lifted the blankets past Rex, revealing the bottom edge of the bed and floor beyond. "See?" He had to see. It was important for both of them. Dylan regarded the reality of the bed and floor for a long moment. Then he shrugged and said simply, "It's different when you're gone," and turned off the flashlight. Outside the blankets, Heather tucked Dylan in for what she hoped would be the last time that night. He looked wide awake but didn't ask to stay up any longer. She clicked off the small nightlight next to his bed. "On, please," he asked. The moonlight didn't seem as bright as before. "Okay, sweetie," she said, switching the light back on. "Night-night. Sleep tight." And then he joined her for the "Don't let the bedbugs bite" finale. She kissed him and went to the door. Before she could leave, Dylan stopped her. "Daddy coming home?" "He's on his way." "He can follow the breadcrumbs, right?" "Right. And when he returns, he'll cover us with kisses and we'll all be safe," she thought. Then she left, closing the door behind her. "If the birds don't eat them first," Dylan said quietly to himself as he stared out the window. He was hoping not to fall asleep too quickly tonight. Rex was still weak from this afternoon's battle. The cracked bedroom mirror was showing some ugly truths again, so Heather turned away from it. Headlights showed on the street outside the house, and she ran to the window. A Honda putted by. Telling herself that Chase wasn't due home for at least another hour didn't keep her from feeling disappointed. She needed him now. Dylan needed him too. Heather went down to the living room and sat on the couch with a cup of coffee, intending to wait up. She might as well. Sleep seemed unlikely under the circumstances. Her mind revved into overdrive again. An old worry had come out into the light earlier and had been growing all day. The worry that maybe she wasn't well. She recognized her weak resolution to call a therapist as a form of denial. Deep down she suspected that there was more wrong with her than could be solved by an hour-long chat. It seemed that the convergence of events, the nightmares, the earthquake, the calls, and even the possibility of making another Elm Street, was overloading a mind predisposed to instability. The tears came almost as soon as the thoughts, because there it was, out in the open now. I might be having a breakdown, she thought bitterly, and maybe I'm the last to know. Chase probably suspected. Julie practically said it this afternoon. Heather's grandmother had been insane. No doubt about that. Her mother hadn't been crazy per se, but as she grew older she became more difficult and developed Alzheimer's relatively early. As a teenager and young adult, just the possibility of having inherited mental illness had almost driven her crazy. Then one day she folded up the fear and tucked it in the back pocket of her mind. But she wasn't only worried for herself. Her worry was for Dylan. He seemed to be having a problem himself, and in her condition she felt incapable of helping him, and she was responsible for whatever was wrong. But Chase could do something. He could help them both. Without realizing it, Heather's spinning thoughts whirled her into sleep.
From the Journal of David Bergantino, May 21st, 1994. This project is really starting to get to me. Freddy Krueger is now a frequent flyer in my dream plane. I should be honored by his presence, but to tell the truth, I just wish he'd wait till I'm done with the book. He's making it hard to write. I wake up so exhausted. The dream goes something like this. He chases me through the boiler room. I remember it from the movies. All burned up, swinging his claw. He doesn't quite reach me, but he never stops coming after me. His awful laugh is everywhere. At first it's not so bad, but it's a long dream. When I finally do wake up, I feel like I've run a 3-minute mile. If he came up with a one-liner every once in a while, just to break the tension, I wouldn't mind the dream at all. Thing is, he doesn't say anything funny. And it makes me feel like nightmares did when I was a kid, before scary became a hobby of mine. It makes me feel afraid.
The moon lit up the desert on either side of the 2-lane highway. Except for the low vegetation and the occasional cactus, there wasn't much to see. Chase wasn't looking anyway. His eyes were locked on the road ahead. With low expectations, he picked up the portable phone beside him and pressed the talk button. Static squilled out of the earpiece. He swore to himself and threw it on the seat beside him. A car approached without dimming its brights. Its high-intensity beams nearly blinded him. He squinted against the light, unconsciously suppressing a yawn. The car passed, and after a few moments he could see again. Heather's call had shaken him deeply. He had never told her about his own nightmares. She had enough problems without having to know that. Besides, he only remembered snatches of his dreams, never the whole thing, as Heather apparently did. But he knew the nightmares were strange and left him with an overwhelming feeling of danger. Another item Heather didn't need to know. She relied so much on his strength at times. Knowing he was afraid would have pulled the rug right out from under her. The white lines of the road riveted him as they strobed hypnotically past. He shook his head and yawned. God, am I tired, he thought. If he could get something on the radio. But, as he discovered with the phone, he was in the middle of nowhere. Only static blasted out of the speakers. He pressed the seek button, but the tuner zoomed up the dial, not locking onto any signals. About 100 stations whizzed by, each playing a different kind of static. The numbers started at the bottom of the dial again and finally stopped. They blinked, indicating a weak signal. The faint sound of a news report fought with the crackling. tonic nightmare. Fault line hitherto unknown. Seems spread. A blast of static overcame the voice. It returned, but Chase could only make out a few more words, so extensive that before it faded away completely. He shut off the radio. The only remaining sounds were the wind whining past the car and the plock, plock, plock of his tires over expansion joints. His mind returned to Heather and Dylan. Whatever was happening involved his son now. Perhaps it had been wrong of him not to tell Heather about his nightmares. This morning the cut on his hand had mystified him. It probably happened, as he said, on the picture glass, but he wasn't certain. He'd been having a nightmare as well, and in it he thought he remembered cutting his hand, but he didn't remember how. Even now he could feel the nightmare's pull. With a start, he realized he'd been dozing. The car had begun to drift onto the other side of the road. He violently shook his head and jerked the steering wheel, returning the car to the proper lane. That was almost very bad. He reached down and scratched his leg. His muscles were sore from sitting in the car for over 2 hours. Then he tried another tack to stay awake. He began to sing, "This is me, losing my religion." It sounded awful, but then who was around to hear? "Look at me, losing my religion." Focused on the road and singing, Chase didn't hear the tiny ripping noise coming from the seat between his legs. Nor did he spy 4 tiny steel points poking through the fabric there. Soon they grew into 4 long claws, but he didn't see. After repeating the same 2 lines several times, he realized it was all he knew of that particular song, and stopped singing. More than his aching muscles was making him uncomfortable now. With a quick grab, he readjusted his private parts, which had felt as tightly packed as sardines in his jeans. He barely missed cutting his fingers on razors down there, but the blades swerved out of the way. It wasn't time. Deep breaths were in order now. He knew he should have stopped for some coffee, but it was too late. There would be no place to stop until he was almost home. He lightly slapped his face to get the blood moving and noticed a torn piece of upholstery clinging to one finger. Barely giving it a second thought, he flicked it away. He was nodding now, unaware how tired he really was. The day had been long and exhausting. Maybe he and Heather would talk in the morning. Right now, the plan was to hit the sack as soon as he got home. 4 moonlit blades glinted near Chase's shoulder. 4 long, thin shadows fell across his neck, but he didn't notice. Chase's eyes closed and his head fell limply forward. He had fallen asleep. The claw struck then. It leaped, burying the blades deep into his chest, pulling down with inhuman force. Chase's scream became a gurgle as his shredded lungs filled with blood. The truck driver saw the oncoming headlights. When they jerked to the left and crossed into his lane, he said a prayer. There was nothing he could do to avoid the collision. Heather awoke suddenly on the couch. Her arms jerked upward reflexively, almost upsetting the coffee cup on the table next to her. The room became quiet suddenly, and she realized she had been screaming. She looked around. On the stairs sat Dylan, watching her. "Mommy scared?" he asked. She was still disoriented, but yeah, she was scared, though she had no intention of admitting that to Dylan. "Mommy's fine, Dylan. I just had a bad dream." She couldn't remember it. "What are you doing out of bed?" "Rex woke me up. He was fighting." Before Heather could respond to Dylan, the doorbell rang. Who the hell, she thought? "Dylan, you go back to sleep now," she told him on her way to the door. "Not sleepy." He wasn't talking back, but he didn't want to go upstairs. Heather peered through the eye-hole in the door. 2 highway patrolmen stood outside. Heather's stomach turned inside out. "Dylan," she said, trying to keep herself under control, "go to bed. I mean it." He caught the panicked tone in her voice and went up to his room. As soon as Dylan was out of sight, the shaking started. Her body quaked violently with the fear that comes when it's late at night and 2 policemen are standing on the front doorstep. Chase hadn't returned. At first, all she could do was claw at the side bolt. Finally, the door swung open. Two very grave faces greeted her. "Heather Langenkamp," said one officer. "Yes." "Is Chase Porter your husband?" His use of the present tense seemed forced and unnatural. The look on his face said he was extremely uncomfortable with what he had to tell her. "Yes." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm afraid there was an accident. It appears he fell asleep while driving, ma'am." Black dots swarmed in her vision. She had to lean her hand against the wall to steady herself. "Is he... I mean, was he hurt?" "I'm afraid it's worse than that, ma'am." The ground tilted at an odd angle, Heather thought. Apparently only she noticed because the patrolman didn't move. One did. He leaned slightly forward to catch her in case she collapsed. "Is he dead?" Why did she have to ask? Couldn't they have just come out with it? Heather realized the fearful voice was her only remaining inner voice. "Yes, ma'am." "Are you sure it's him? The second patrolman interrupted her gently. "We have his effects. You can confirm from that." And he held out a clear plastic bag containing a wallet, a watch, and some money. All Chase's things, but that still doesn't mean... "I want to see the body," she suddenly decided. No, you don't, ma'am. It's not necessary." By the look in his eyes, the patrolman was saying it was not only unnecessary, but not recommended in this case. Heather only became more determined. "I want to see for myself." She spoke slowly and clearly, so there would be no mistake. The two patrolmen looked at each other. Her tone of voice gave them no choice. While they radioed from their car to make arrangements, Heather returned to the house and called Julie.
Los Angeles Times, March 21st, 1993. Death notices. Porter, Chase Porter, 33, passed away March 12th, beloved husband of Heather, dearest father of Dylan, precious son of Glenn and Virginia, brother of Patricia Arndt and Jonathan Porter. Private services will be had. Arrangements by Toman and Sons.
From the Journal of David Bergantino, May 23rd, 1994. Son of a bitch! Chase Porter, Heather's husband, really did die last year. Found the obituary shown on the previous page. That just blows me away. I wonder how Heather feels about that. Geez, if my wife died, I wouldn't turn around and make a movie where the story includes her death, even if it is fictionalized. Wes Craven loses points for insensitivity. Still, Heather's making the movie, so what's up with that? It was really bugging me, so I called my agent, Laurel, and asked how Chase had really died. Was it a car accident? Murder? Suicide? I guess I must have sounded like a ghoul because she didn't want to answer. Instead, she changed the subject. She asked how the writing was going, and I said fine, but slow. When she wanted to know if there was a problem, I just said that I wasn't sleeping well and couldn't concentrate. I didn't want to mention the nightmare specifically. It would sound silly. But when I told her what was wrong, she got really quiet. I must have really weirded her out, asking about Chase. Well, whatever. I was pretty weirded out myself. Then, cheerful as you please, she said to keep working and write good stuff. Pat, pat, pat. Good doggy. Then another call came in and she had to take it. At least that's what she said. Come to think of it, she may have just wanted me off her phone. From the Journal of David Bergantino, June 4th, 1994. Chase's death is on my mind. I can't find any more details. You know, this wouldn't be the first film production with a curse. Not a real one, of course, but a supposed curse, which has a few superstitious individuals nervous. I broached the subject with Laurel, but carefully, setting it up for a laugh. Must have hit her at a bad moment, or a nerve, because she didn't laugh. Not even close. Instead, she told me point blank, "Don't worry about that. Your job is to write the book, so write the book." She was very serious. Reading between the lines, I realized she was asking if I was still interested in writing the book, or should they find someone else. Very quickly, I answered, I'm writing already." And I rolled over and played dead. This probably minor mystery isn't worth screwing up this deal.
Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Chapter 3 of Wes Craven's New Nightmare, a novel by David Bergantino. Guest starring David Bergantino as himself, and Dino from the Dino and Ted Show here on YouTube as the scrapbook narrator. Like I said before, guys, I'm not going to be doing my normal end upload commentary review type thing I do chapter by chapter. When this entire book's finished, I'm going to do a completely separate video that's going to be like a discussion / review on the movie and the book as a cohesive unit. And I got some fun stuff planned for that I didn't want to do here because I didn't want it to take away from the book. Anyways, guys, I will say this much. I am enjoying the book, and I'm enjoying editing the book. I hope you guys have enjoyed the little edits I've done and the things I've thrown in there. I hope that makes it feel a little more cinematic for you. As always, tonight's upload was brought to you by our patrons over on the Patreon page. Our patrons right now are Carl Eakins, Catherine McClear, Sean Campbell, and Cecilia Spears. And I want to thank each 4 of you for your contributions to the channel and for sponsoring the channel and helping keep this channel going and growing for a time to come. And if anybody else listening enjoys the content on this channel and has ever wanted to help out the channel in any way, for as little as $2 a month, you can become a patron for this channel on Patreon and get some pretty cool stuff for doing so. The $2 a month rate gets you early access to some great content that doesn't hit YouTube until after it's hit Patreon. And the $5 a month Patreon sponsorship tier gets you that plus a free ebook every 3 months and a free reward from the merch store once a year. And lots of other cool tiers and rewards. Just check it out. Click the Patreon link in the description below if you would like to help support the channel and help it keep going and growing for years to come. There's still a ton of slasher books left to be added to the halls of the 80s Slasher Library. Alright guys, I'll be back very soon with more of this book. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s Slasher Librarian saying, thank you all for listening, and pleasant screams!